For nearly a century, if an American soldier marched into battle or a family bought fabric for their clothes, that cloth likely came from one specific place. Not a region, but a single, massive brick fortress along the Merrimack River in Manchester, New Hampshire. It did not matter where you lived. The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company literally wove the fabric of the nation. At its peak during World War I, Amoskeag dominated the global textile industry like an unstoppable force of nature. The mill yard stretched for over a mile and a half, employing 17,000 workers who operated nearly 700,000 spindles. It was the largest single factory complex on the face of the earth. Then the arrogance set in. Cheaper Southern competition emerged. The Great Depression swept across the country. But it was not just changing times that killed the brick leviathan. It was the corporate executives down in Boston who deliberately drained the company of its vast wealth, protected their own pockets, and walked away. On Christmas Eve of 1935, after more than a century of absolute dominance, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company died for good, leaving an entire working-class city to freeze in the dark. This is the story of how America's greatest textile empire was built, and how corporate greed tore it apart. Chapter 1. The Vision in the Wilderness. The Merrimack River carried immense force. For centuries, it flowed wildly through New England. Native tribes fished its violent rapids. Early settlers built simple grist mills along its muddy banks. But at Amoskeag Falls, the water dropped exactly 54 feet over a short distance. The roar of the water drowned out all other sounds in the valley. It was raw, unharnessed energy. To most people in the early 19th century, it was just a dangerous stretch of river. But a group of wealthy investors from Massachusetts saw something different. When men look at untamed nature, some see beauty. The Boston Associates saw math. They looked at a roaring waterfall and calculated predictable profit margins. They knew moving water meant mechanical power, and mechanical power meant processing cotton on a scale the world had never seen. These investors had already built successful textile mills in places like Waltham and Lowell. They understood the complex mechanics of mass production. They took raw cotton grown in the South and spun it into finished cloth for the global market. It was a lucrative business, but the city of Lowell was running out of usable space. The water power there reached its absolute limit. The associates desperately needed a new location to expand their empire. They needed a place with more water pressure, vast amounts of cheap land, and absolutely no existing town council to interfere. In 1831, they officially incorporated the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. They did not announce their intentions to the press. Instead, they moved quietly. The company sent secret agents to the wilderness around Amoskeag Falls. These agents posed as ordinary farmers or humble business owners. They approached the local landowners and offered hard cash for large parcels of land along both banks of the river. The locals sold their rocky, plyschine, difficult-to-farm land quickly. They thought they made a good deal with foolish city men. They did not realize they were handing over the foundation of an industrial empire. Within a few short years, the Boston Associates secretly bought thousands of acres. They owned the riverbanks. They owned the critical water rights. They essentially owned the future of the entire region. The land around the falls stood mostly empty at the time. Dense pine trees covered the sandy soil. A few scattered farms dotted the quiet landscape. The Boston Associates brought in engineers and surveyors to change that permanently. They started digging massive canals. A textile mill required a precise, constant flow of water to turn the heavy iron water wheels. The engineers blasted through solid granite using black powder. They built sturdy dams to control the mighty river. They channeled the rushing water into a complex network of upper and lower canals. This was not a small operation. It was a massive reshaping of the earth itself. Hundreds of laborers dug deep trenches by hand. They laid heavy stone blocks to line the waterways. Most companies of the era built a single factory and hoped a village would naturally grow around it. The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company rejected that passive approach. They demanded total control over their environment. They drew up detailed blueprints for an entire city before they laid the first brick of the main mills. They confidently named their future city Manchester, after the industrial heart of England. This was not mere arrogance. It was a clear statement of intent. They planned a grid of wide, straight streets. They designated specific plots for churches, public parks, and worker housing. They designed absolutely everything to serve the mills. The company would own the land, the buildings, the water, and the jobs. The first major brick structures finally began to rise along the newly dug canals. Red clay bricks formed massive, imposing buildings. Workers installed thousands of glass windows to let in natural light. They dragged heavy iron looms into the cavernous rooms. The sheer scale of the construction shocked the few locals who remained to watch. The company was actively building an industrial fortress. The wilderness quickly retreated. In its place stood the cold skeleton of a giant machine. The Boston associates bet their fortunes on the power of the river and the endless global demand for cloth. And they possessed the capital, the land, and the blueprint. Now they just needed the people to make the machine run. The vision in the wilderness was complete. Chapter 2. Building the Brick Leviathan. The soil of New Hampshire yielded excellent clay. Amoskeag took that clay, baked it in massive kilns, and built an empire of red brick. Between 1838 and the end of the century, a continuous wall of mills rose along the eastern bank of the Merrimack River. The scale defied human comprehension. Buildings stretched for over a mile and a half. They stood tall, blocking the morning sun from the rest of the valley. To look at the Amoskeag mills was to look at a man-made mountain range. Workers constructed mill number 1, then mill number 2, and they did not stop. They laid millions of bricks. They hoisted heavy timber beams cut from the surrounding forests. The river provided the power, but human sweat built the machine. The canal system expanded into a dual-level network. The upper canal fed water into the massive turbines. The lower canal carried the exhausted water back to the river. The noise of the rushing water mixed with the deafening clatter of thousands of wooden looms. The ground literally shook beneath the feet of anyone walking near the milliard. But a machine needs operators. A leviathan needs food. The Boston associates knew they could not just build factories. They had to build a society to keep those factories running. The company engineered the city of Manchester down to the smallest detail. They laid out Elm Street to be wide enough for large crowds and heavy horse traffic. They designated specific plots for public parks to give workers a place to breathe on Sundays. They donated land for churches, carefully ensuring every major denomination had a place to worship. Religion kept workers moral and obedient. The company constructed massive blocks of boarding houses right next to the mills. These brick buildings housed the thousands of single young women coming from rural farms to work the looms. Amoskeag did not just provide a bed, they imposed strict rules. Curfew fell at 10 o'clock at night. Church attendance was mandatory. Alcohol was strictly forbidden. The company employed matrons to enforce these rules. If a worker broke a rule, she lost her job and her bed in the same hour. The control did not stop at the boarding house doors. Amoskeag owned the waterworks. They built the fire stations and bought the fire engines. They surveyed the cemetery where the workers would eventually be buried. They even influenced the local police force. It is a strange thing to observe a city where the mayor holds less power than a mill agent. When one single corporation builds your home, signs your paycheck, paves your street, and funds your church, personal freedom becomes a very flexible concept. The residents of Manchester technically lived in a democracy. In reality, they lived in a corporate fiefdom. The sheer economic gravity of Amoskeag pulled everything into its orbit. Independent businesses opened along Elm Street, but they survived solely on the wages paid by the company. If Amoskeag cut hours, the bakeries sold less bread. If Amoskeag issued a bonus, the tailor shops sold more suits. The heartbeat of the city was not the town hall. It was the large bell mounted atop the main mill tower. That bell controlled time itself. It rang to wake the city before dawn. It rang to signal the start of the shift. It rang for the short lunch break. It rang to release the exhausted workers back into the dark streets at night. People set their pocket watches by the mill bell. They organized their lives around its harsh, metallic clang. By the mid-19th century, a profound realization settled over the people of the valley. They were not citizens of Manchester. They were subjects of Amoskeag. The company had transformed a wild river into a controlled power source. It had transformed an empty forest into a grid of brick and stone. Most importantly, it had transformed free farmers into a disciplined industrial workforce. The Leviathan was fully awake. It consumed raw cotton by the ton. It consumed human energy by the hour. And it produced unimaginable wealth for men sitting in comfortable offices down in Boston. The machine functioned perfectly. It was ready to grow even larger. Chapter 3. The Immigrant Engine. The brick mills stood hungry. A machine of that size required constant fuel. In the beginning, the Boston associates relied on young women from New England farms. These mill girls provided cheap and reliable labor. They spun cotton for a few years, saved some money, and returned home to marry. It was a temporary arrangement, but as Amoskeag expanded its footprint along the Merrimack River, the supply of farm girls dried up. The company needed permanent workers. They needed a massive and dedicated underclass. They found them crossing borders and oceans. The first major wave came from the north. French Canadians left their struggling farms in Quebec and rode trains straight down to Manchester. They arrived by the thousands. They brought a strong work ethic and large families. Entire households went to work in the mills. Children swept the factory floors. Mothers tended the spinning frames. Fathers maintained the heavy machinery. The company welcomed them. They worked long hours without complaint. They settled into specific neighborhoods on the west side of the river. They built their own Catholic churches and spoke French in the streets. But Amoskeag kept growing. By the late 19th century, even the French Canadians were not enough. The company agents looked across the Atlantic. The Great Migration from Europe provided an endless supply of desperate hands. Trains rolled into the Manchester station every single week. They unloaded Greeks, Poles, Germans, Irish, and Swedes. Most arrived with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and a pressing need for a wage. Manchester quickly fractured into distinct ethnic enclaves. The Irish claimed their territory. The Greeks built their Orthodox church on another corner. The Polish workers gathered in their own social halls. Dozens of languages echoed on Elm Street on a Saturday night. Yet, inside the brick walls of the mill, everyone spoke the same language of production. The deafening noise of the looms made conversation impossible anyway. Workers communicated through simple hand signals. The machine leveled all cultural differences. Managing such a diverse workforce required a specific strategy. Amoskeag perfected a system of corporate paternalism. The company provided land for ethnic clubs. They sponsored worker baseball teams and built a large stadium for Sunday games. They offered a company hospital and a dental clinic. They even started a company magazine that celebrated worker loyalty. It is a peculiar dynamic to witness. When a massive corporation plays the role of a generous father, it always expects unquestioning obedience in return. What? The company provided these benefits not out of pure kindness, but to prevent the formation of labor unions. They kept the different nationalities slightly divided in their social lives, but perfectly synchronized on the factory floor. This strategy worked brilliantly for decades. The workers remained loyal. Strikes were rare and easily broken. The immigrant engine hummed with terrifying efficiency. Generation after generation walked through the heavy iron gates. A child of Greek immigrants might start as a bobbin boy, work 50 years, and retire as a loom fixer. The mill consumed their youth and their hearing, but it put food on the table. By 1915, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company reached its absolute zenith. It was no longer just a large factory. It was the largest single textile manufacturing complex on the face of the earth. Over 17,000 men, women, and children worked there. They operated nearly 700,000 spindles. They tended to 24,000 individual looms. The physical scale staggered the imagination. The noise generated by this army of machines was apocalyptic. It was a physical force that vibrated through the bedrock of the valley. People living miles away could hear the low, steady rumble of the mills. Inside the weave rooms, the sound shattered the air. The wooden floors shook violently. Management kept the humidity high to prevent the cotton threads from snapping, turning the massive rooms into tropical sweatshops. Cotton dust hung thick in the air, coating the lungs of the workers, yet the work never stopped. Millions of yards of cloth rolled out of the brick Leviathan every single week. The immigrant engine powered a golden age of production. The Boston associates watched their bank accounts swell to historic proportions. They believed this perfect system would run forever. Chapter 4. The Peak of the Textile World. In 1914, conflict erupted across Europe. World War I brought destruction to millions, but it delivered unimaginable wealth to the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. War demands materials. Armies need uniforms, bandages, blankets, and durable canvas tents. When the United States entered the fight in 1917, the federal government required these supplies in staggering quantities. Military procurement officers turned immediately to the brick Leviathan in Manchester. No other facility on the continent possessed the capacity to fulfill such massive orders. Amoskeag transitioned seamlessly into wartime production. The giant looms shifted from weaving civilian ginghams to producing heavy military fabrics. Workers spun coarse, durable khaki cotton day and night. The factory operated without pause. Freight trains rolled into the mill yard empty and left hours later, packed to the roof with finished goods bound for the European front lines. The company produced millions of yards of cloth specifically for the war effort. If an American soldier marched through the mud in France, Amoskeag likely wove the fabric on his back. This unprecedented volume of production generated rivers of cash. Money flowed directly from government defense contracts into the bank accounts of the Boston associates. The company reported record-breaking profits year after year during the conflict. The executives sat in their quiet, comfortable offices in Massachusetts, far removed from the deafening noise and choking cotton dust of the Manchester looms. They reviewed the quarterly balance sheets and saw only endless prosperity. It is a common pattern in business history. Taquan. When a corporation achieves total market dominance, the men in charge frequently confuse favorable global circumstances with their own brilliant leadership. They begin to believe their success is a permanent law of nature, rather than a temporary economic spike. The Boston associates fell directly into this exact trap. They looked at the massive dividend checks they wrote to themselves and felt entirely invincible. These executives held absolute faith in the Amoskeag brand. Textile buyers worldwide knew the name and trusted the quality. The board assumed customers would always pay a premium for their cloth, regardless of the price. This dangerous arrogance blinded the leadership to the physical reality inside their own mills. The machines in Manchester ran constantly, but they were aging rapidly. The heavy iron looms and spinning frames suffered intense wear and tear from the relentless wartime production schedules. The massive factory complex required significant capital reinvestment to replace outdated equipment with modern, faster, and more efficient machinery. Instead of modernizing the plant, the board chose greed. They distributed the massive wartime profits directly to their shareholders. They actively drained the corporate treasury to pay enormous cash dividends. They rewarded themselves richly while completely neglecting the very machine that generated their immense wealth. The directors quickly dismissed any internal suggestions of upgrading the facilities. They argued that Amoskeag held a permanent monopoly on quality. In their minds, no competitor could possibly match their established scale or their historic reputation. They deliberately ignored the subtle technological changes happening across the wider industry. They felt completely secure within their walled industrial fortress. The immense physical size of the operation gave the board a false sense of security. They reasoned that an empire commanding 17,000 workers and occupying miles of brick buildings could never fail. They failed to understand a fundamental rule of industry. Massive size often creates fatal inertia. A giant machine is incredibly difficult to maneuver when the market suddenly changes direction. The year 1919 marked the absolute peak of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. The Great War ended. The lucrative military contracts evaporated, but a brief post-war economic boom kept the looms running for a short time. The executives celebrated their historic triumph. They stood at the absolute summit of the global textile world. They controlled the national market. They controlled the entire city of Manchester. They controlled the daily lives of their workers. However, the summit is a dangerous place to stand. Every step forward from the peak leads inevitably downward. The executives refused to look down. They refused to look toward the southern states, where a quiet industrial revolution was already gaining momentum. They simply counted their wartime money, locked their vaults, and confidently prepared for a future that would never arrive. Chapter 5. Whispers of the South. The guns fell silent in Europe in 1918. The massive military contracts disappeared overnight. Freight trains leaving Manchester no longer carried heavy canvas and khaki uniforms. They carried standard gingham and flannel, but the civilian market could not possibly absorb the massive volume of cloth Amoskeag produced during the war. Warehouses along the Merrimack River began to fill with unsold inventory. For the first time in years, the company actively slowed the giant looms. The deafening roar of the milliard dropped by a fraction of a decibel. While Manchester slowed down, a new industrial force gathered strength hundreds of miles away. The American South had spent decades recovering from the Civil War. Now, it was ready to build. Southern businessmen looked at the New England textile monopoly and saw a highly vulnerable target. They held three massive economic advantages. First, they grew the cotton in their own backyards. They did not need to pay expensive railroad freight charges to ship raw materials 1,000 miles north. The cotton went directly from the field to the local factory floor. Second, the South possessed a vast pool of desperate and cheap labor. Poor farmers eagerly left their exhausted fields for factory wages. These workers accepted pay rates far below the standard in Massachusetts or New Hampshire. They did not form labor unions. They did not organize strikes. They simply worked the hours management demanded. Third, the Southern mills did not rely on the unpredictable power of rivers or outdated steam boilers. They built brand new factories powered by modern electricity. Inside Amoskeag, a chaotic jungle of leather belts and spinning metal shafts connected the looms to the main water turbines. These belts blocked the light, created dangerous dust, and caused horrific accidents. The Southern mills used individual electric motors for each machine. electric power drove their looms with a clean, ruthless, and consistent efficiency. It is a fatal flaw of human nature to dismiss a new threat simply because it looks different from the established order. The Boston executives looked at the Southern mills and laughed. They sat in their mahogany boardrooms and saw small, scattered factories run by men they considered uneducated farmers. They could not imagine these regional upstarts threatening the great Amoskeag empire. They failed to realize that 20 small, efficient, electrified mills could easily outproduce one massive, aging brick leviathan. The Southern mills produced simple and coarse cloth at first. They severely undercut Amoskeag on price. Textile buyers quickly noticed. Retailers care about profit margins, not corporate history. They started buying Southern fabric in large quantities. The executives in Boston received the declining sales reports. They saw the lost contracts. Their reaction was completely inadequate. They did not panic. They did not order new electric machinery for the Manchester facilities. They simply declared that Amoskeag cloth possessed superior quality, and customers would eventually return to the premium brand. Inside the Manchester mills, the physical reality was grim. The heavy iron looms from the 1890s required constant maintenance to keep running. Belts snapped frequently. Heavy gears ground down. Furthermore, the water levels in the Merrimack River fluctuated with the seasons, forcing the company to slow production during dry summers. The board of directors absolutely refused to spend money to fix these fundamental structural problems. They squeezed the existing machinery harder. They expected their aging equipment to compete with brand new electric looms in the Carolinas. It was an impossible mathematical equation. By the early 1920s, the whispers from the South grew into a deafening roar. Southern mills rapidly expanded their product lines. They learned to weave finer fabrics. They matched Amoskeag in quality and beat them severely on price. The great fortress in Manchester was now under direct siege, not by an invading army, but by a modern economic reality. The Boston associates finally realized the extreme danger of the situation. However, their immense pride prevented them from making the necessary capital investments. Instead of upgrading their factories to match the Southern efficiency, they decided to force their workers to pay the entire price of the competition. They prepared to turn the power of the brick leviathan against the very people who kept it alive. Chapter 6: The Breaking Point. The Boston associates watched their market share vanish. Southern textile mills stole their customers month by month. The executives needed an immediate solution to lower their production costs. They faced a clear choice. They could invest their massive wartime profits into modern electric machinery, or they could extract the difference directly from their employees. They chose the latter. They did not touch the aging looms. They targeted the payroll. In early February 1922, mill overseers nailed crisp white notices to the heavy wooden doors of every brick building in the yard. The text was brutally brief. Management announced a flat 20% reduction in all worker wages. Furthermore, they unilaterally increased the mandatory work week from 48 to 54 hours. The company demanded significantly more sweat for drastically less pay. They expected the immigrant workforce to simply absorb the financial blow and keep the machines running. It is a predictable tragedy of corporate paternalism. When a massive company positions itself as a strict but generous parent, a sudden and severe wage cut feels less like a calculated economic necessity and more like a profound personal betrayal. The carefully constructed illusion of a corporate family shatters instantly, leaving only raw exploitation in its wake. The workers did not see a struggling business. They saw wealthy men in Massachusetts stealing bread from the tables of Manchester. The workers read the notices as they arrived for their shifts. Disbelief quickly hardened into fury. For decades, the Amoskeag management successfully kept their workforce divided. They encouraged the French Canadians, the Greeks, the Irish, and the Poles to remain in their separate neighborhoods and social clubs. But the white notices on the doors created an instant, powerful unity. The language barrier disappeared completely. Shared outrage forged a single, solid block of resistance. On February 13th, 1922, the immigrant engine finally stopped. Dawn broke over the Merrimack River. The great iron bell in the main tower rang out across the valley, signaling the start of the shift. Its harsh metallic clang echoed through the cold morning air. Normally, this sound prompted a massive flood of humanity to pour down Elm Street and through the factory gates. On this morning, nobody answered the call. 17,000 men, women, and children refused to cross the brick threshold. They stayed in their neighborhoods. They gathered in the streets. They formed dense, angry picket lines outside the mills. The physical impact on the city was immediate and shocking. For the first time in nearly a century, the brick leviathan fell completely silent. The heavy iron water wheels stopped turning in the canals. The thousands of leather belts hung motionless from the ceilings. The deafening, earth-shaking clatter of the wooden looms ceased. The sudden quiet terrified the residents of Manchester. Generations of citizens had lived their entire lives feeling the low, constant rumble of the mills vibrating through their floorboards. The noise was the heartbeat of the city. Its absence felt like a sudden death. The silence spread from the Milliard into the commercial district. Independent shops closed their doors. Bakeries stopped baking. The economic arteries of the city stopped flowing. The company immediately locked the massive iron gates. The executives down in Boston expected a very short fight. They calculated the meager savings of their workers. They firmly believed the immigrant families would starve within a few weeks and crawl back to the looms, fully accepting the management terms. They completely miscalculated the depth of the anger. The workers organized massive soup kitchens. Local farmers sympathetic to the cause donated wagon loads of potatoes and cabbage. Small, independent merchants along Elm Street extended credit to the striking families, risking their own bankruptcies to support the walkout. The strike dragged on far beyond the expectations of the board of directors. Spring melted the snow, and summer heat baked the brick buildings. Tall grass began to grow undisturbed between the cobblestones and the empty Milliard. The breaking point permanently severed the unspoken, decades-old contract between capital and labor at Amoskeag. The company exposed its true nature. It was no longer a benevolent provider. It was a hostile adversary, willing to starve a city to maintain its profit margins. The workers held the line, determined to break the absolute power of the Boston Associates, completely unaware of the permanent damage this silence was causing to their own future. Chapter 7. A Hollow Victory. The strike lasted 9 agonizing months. Summer faded into autumn. The bitter cold of the New Hampshire winter approached. The worker soup kitchens ran completely dry. Local farmers could no longer afford to give away their harvest. The independent merchants on Elm Street faced their own bankruptcies and stopped extending credit. Hunger proved much stronger than anger. The workers held the line as long as humanly possible. But a man cannot watch his children starve for a principle. In November 1922, the immigrant engine sputtered back to life. The workers finally surrendered. They walked back through the massive iron gates with their heads bowed. They accepted the devastating 20% wage cut. They accepted the grueling 54-hour work week. They accepted total defeat. The great iron bell rang again. Oh, the heavy water wheels began to turn in the canals. The leather belts slapped against the wooden ceilings. The deafening roar returned to the valley. The executives down in Boston celebrated their triumph. They successfully broke the strike. They maintained their absolute authority over the workforce. They saved their profit margins on paper. It is a brutal reality of industrial warfare that capital can simply outweight human biology. A corporation does not bleed. and a corporation certainly does not need to eat. The Boston Associates won this battle primarily because they fought from warm offices, while their opponents literally froze in the streets of Manchester. But the company won a completely ruined prize. The Amoskeag that reopened in November was not the same Amoskeag that closed in February. The 9 months of absolute silence fundamentally destroyed the internal machinery of the workforce. The physical plant also suffered. The heavy iron looms sat unused in the damp New England weather. Gears rusted. Leather belts rotted in the stagnant air. Restarting the massive machine required weeks of costly repairs. More importantly, the best talent vanished. The skilled mechanics, the most experienced loom fixers, and the fastest weavers did not return when the gates unlocked. These valuable workers packed their tools and left Manchester forever. They moved to other industrial cities where management treated them with basic respect. They left behind a desperate, unskilled, and deeply resentful workforce. The atmosphere inside the brick walls turned highly toxic. The old paternalistic loyalty was completely dead. Workers who previously treated the company property with care now treated it with quiet contempt. They did not actively riot or destroy the machines, but they stopped caring entirely. If a complex loom jammed, they took their time fixing it. If a thread snapped, they let it ruin a full yard of cloth before casually stopping the frame. They worked slowly. They worked carelessly. They gave the company exactly what the reduced wages paid for. Production efficiency collapsed. The daily output volume dropped significantly compared to the previous year. The quality of the Amoskeag cloth, once the absolute gold standard of the global textile industry, deteriorated rapidly. The foremen tried to enforce strict discipline, but they could not force a hateful workforce to care about their craft. However, the true catastrophe waited in the corporate sales offices. The Boston executives fully expected to simply turn the machines back on and instantly resume their absolute dominance of the market. They confidently contacted their old buyers in New York and Chicago. They proudly announced that Amoskeag was back in business and ready to take massive orders for the upcoming season. The buyers politely declined. During the 9 months that the Manchester mills sat completely silent, the rest of the world did not stop needing cloth. The garment manufacturers needed highly reliable suppliers to meet their own deadlines. They looked at the chaotic strike in New England and permanently shifted their massive contracts to the American South. The southern mills operated on reliable electric power and did not suffer from labor disputes. They delivered cheap, decent cloth exactly on schedule. The buyers realized a fatal truth. Why? They did not actually need Amoskeag. The legendary brand name meant absolutely nothing if the factory could not deliver the physical goods. The prolonged strike forced the market to find alternatives, and the market discovered it strongly preferred those cheaper, faster alternatives. The executives stared at empty order books. Their massive brick leviathan was finally awake, but it had nothing to eat. They forced their workers into total submission, ruined their own production quality, and completely lost their loyal customer base in a single disastrous year. The victory over the workers was entirely hollow. The Boston Associates saved a fraction of a cent on wages, but they sacrificed the entire future of the empire to get it. The slow death of Manchester had officially begun. Chapter 8. The Great Depression Strikes. The year 1929 broke the global economy. The stock market collapse in October destroyed wealth across the country. For the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, the Great Depression did not start the fire. It simply poured gasoline on an already burning building. The company was bleeding market share for a decade. Now, the market itself ceased to exist. People stopped buying new clothes. Working families mended old shirts and patched worn trousers instead of buying fresh fabric. The global demand for cotton dropped to historic lows. Inside the Manchester Milliard, the effect was immediate and severe. The massive brick warehouses along the river filled to the ceiling with unsold cloth. The company could not move the inventory at any price. Then a new enemy appeared. It did not come from the textile mills in the south. It came from the chemistry laboratory. Scientists perfected artificial fibers. Rayon entered the consumer market in massive quantities. It looked and felt like silk. It cost a fraction of the price of Amoskeag premium cotton. It did not shrink in the wash. It held bright chemical dyes beautifully. The modern consumer wanted rayon dresses and rayon stockings. Amoskeag only knew how to spin and weave traditional cotton and wool. Their massive, specialized iron machinery could not easily process these new synthetic threads. The brick leviathan was an apex predator perfectly adapted to a world that suddenly disappeared. It is a cruel law of business that a company must either adapt or die, and massive companies often find themselves entirely too heavy to move. The executives in Boston stared at their grim financial ledgers. They saw zero demand for their expensive traditional cloth and skyrocketing demand for cheap modern synthetics. They made the only calculation left to them. They began to shut the great machine down. They did not lock the iron gates all at once. The death of the mills happened in agonizing, slow stages. Management closed mill number 4 first, then they shut down the entire worsted department. They laid off skilled workers by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The deafening, vibrating roar of the valley slowly faded into an eerie, unnatural quiet. The city of Manchester choked on the silence. The local economy relied entirely on the mill wages. When the Amoskeag paycheck stopped, the city literally starved. Working families lost their company-owned homes. They moved into cramped, unheated tenements on the edge of town. Men who spent 30 years mastering the complex operations of the looms now stood shivering in long bread lines. They shoveled snow for pennies. They begged for stale food at the back doors of the few remaining restaurants on Elm Street. The executives tried a few desperate late measures. They finally attempted to retool some machines to produce rayon, but they were years behind the competition. They lacked the proper equipment and the technical expertise. They produced inferior synthetic cloth that nobody wanted to buy. They slashed prices on their remaining cotton goods, taking massive financial losses just to clear the overflowing warehouses. Nothing worked. The economic gravity of the Great Depression pulled them relentlessly downward. The vast milliard turned into a decaying ghost town. Weeds grew thick between the brick buildings. Warped, broken glass from shattered windows littered the empty courtyards. The giant brick smokestacks stood cold and smokeless against the gray winter sky. Out of the 17,000 workers who once filled the yard at the peak, only a desperate few thousand remained. They worked sporadic, unpredictable shifts, earning barely enough money to survive the week. The city government of Manchester faced total collapse. Property tax revenues vanished because nobody could afford to pay. The local banks held massive amounts of worthless debt. The entire region spiraled into deep poverty. The brick fortress that built the city now dragged it directly into ruin. Down in Boston, the board of directors gathered in their quiet, warm boardrooms. They realized the manufacturing operation was permanently doomed. The mills bled cash every single day they remained open. But Amoskeag still held a massive amount of liquid assets and cash reserves from its past glory days. The executives faced a critical choice. They could spend those reserves trying to keep the mills alive for the workers, or they could protect the money for the shareholders. They did not hesitate. They chose the money. They began plotting a complex legal maneuver to extract the remaining wealth and abandon the dying Leviathan on the banks of the Merrimack River. Chapter 9. The Final Betrayal. The Boston Associates faced a stark reality by the early 1930s. The great Amoskeag Manufacturing Company could no longer sell enough cloth to cover the cost of running the massive brick mills. Every day the water wheels turned, the company lost money. Yet the corporation itself was not completely broke. Decades of extreme profits had built a massive cash reserve. They held millions of dollars in liquid assets, government bonds, and cash. It is a bitter irony of corporate finance that a business can be entirely dead on the factory floor, but still very much alive in the accounting ledgers. The executives saw this clear division. They looked at the struggling workers in Manchester and then looked at the massive pile of cash in their Boston bank accounts. They decided they needed to separate the two permanently. They executed a brilliant and entirely legal financial maneuver. Back in 1927, sensing trouble on the horizon, they had reorganized the corporate structure. They split Amoskeag into two distinct entities. One company, the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, held the physical operations, the massive brick buildings, the aging machinery, and the immense debt. A completely separate entity, the Amoskeag Company, took possession of the cash, the profitable investments, and the liquid assets. This maneuver effectively built a legal firewall between the wealth of the investors and the growing poverty of the factory. When the Great Depression hit its absolute bottom, the manufacturing side of Amoskeag suffocated under the weight of its own obsolescence. The executives claimed they had no money left to modernize the looms or pay the workers. This was technically true for the manufacturing entity. But sitting safely behind the legal firewall, the holding company protected a vast fortune. The people of Manchester watched their city dying. They fully understood what the Boston executives were doing. The city was bleeding to death while the owners protected their gold. A group of local business leaders, prominent citizens, and even some desperate workers made one final attempt to save the brick Leviathan. They formed a citizens' committee. They pooled their meager local resources. They begged for loans from regional banks. They essentially tried to buy the company back from the Boston associates to keep the mills running and save the local economy. They managed to raise a substantial amount of money considering the crushing poverty of the era. They presented their desperate offer to the executives. Midi cry, they asked to buy the physical plant and secured just a small portion of the cash reserves to fund immediate modernization. They promised they could make the mills profitable again if they just had local control. The Boston associates listened to the pleas of the city they built. They calmly reviewed the financial offer. Then they firmly rejected it. They calculated they could make a much better return on their investment by simply liquidating the physical assets and keeping the cash entirely for themselves. They chose to protect the capital of the wealthy shareholders over the survival of a working-class city. In the winter of 1935, the final blow arrived. The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company officially filed for bankruptcy protection. The courts appointed a legal referee to oversee the liquidation process. The referee traveled to Manchester and stood before a crowded room of terrified workers, local merchants, and city officials. He delivered the final verdict. The mills would close permanently. The great machine would never turn again. The company could not be saved. The timing added a specific cruelty to the final decision. The court finalized the liquidation order right around Christmas Eve in 1935. The workers of Manchester received their final permanent layoff notices just as the winter holiday arrived. Families who had given 3 generations to the looms now faced total ruin. The Boston executives secured their fortunes, packed their briefcases, and walked away from the Merrimack River forever. They left behind an empty, rotting industrial fortress. The heavy iron gates slammed shut for the final time. The water in the canals stopped flowing into the massive turbines. Chief, the great bell in the main tower fell permanently silent. The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company birthed the city of Manchester from the wilderness. For an entire century, it fed the city controlled the city, and defined the city. Now, it abandoned the city to freeze in the dark. The immigrant engine was completely dead. Only the massive empty brick shell remained on the riverbank. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Bricks. The winter of 1936 arrived in Manchester with a brutal, quiet cold. The massive Amoskeag Milliard, once the loudest place in New England, stood entirely silent. Snow piled up undisturbed against the heavy iron gates. Ice froze solid in the intricate canal system. The giant brick buildings cast long, dark shadows over the frozen Merrimack River. They no longer looked like factories. They looked like massive industrial tombs. Inside the walls, the decay started immediately. Without the constant heat of the steam pipes, the deep New England freeze cracked the mortar. Pigeons roosted in the high rafters of the empty weave rooms. Rust consumed the remaining metal gears of the forgotten machinery. The sheer physical scale of the abandonment staggered anyone who walked past it. Over 1.5 miles of continuous red brick simply sat rotting under the gray winter sky. It is a profound historical tragedy when a city outlives the very reason for its existence. Manchester was not a normal town that just happened to have a factory. It was a custom-built machine, and the owners had permanently removed its engine. The thousands of workers who stayed faced years of grinding poverty. Many simply packed their meager belongings and left the valley forever. They went looking for new jobs in different states. The grand experiment of the Boston Associates ended in total physical and economic ruin for the working class. But the story of the Brick Leviathan did not end entirely with the bankruptcy court. A physical structure of that magnitude does not simply disappear. The empty mills presented a massive problem for the local government, but they also presented a strange, hidden opportunity. A group of local Manchester businessmen realized they could not let the massive complex rot away completely. They formed a new company called Amoskeag Industries. They pooled local capital and bought the entire physical plant from the bankruptcy referee. They did not buy it to spin cotton or revive the textile monopoly. They bought it to break the empire apart entirely. These local leaders understood a new economic reality. The era of the single, massive industrial monopoly was completely dead in New England. The future belonged to smaller, agile, and specialized businesses. So they took the giant brick Leviathan and carved it into manageable pieces. They built heavy dividing walls inside the cavernous weave rooms. They leased the newly created spaces to dozens of different unrelated companies. Slowly, fragmented life returned to the Milliard. A shoe manufacturer rented the first floor of Mill Number 1. A small electronics company took the third floor. A local warehouse operation used the basement levels. The deafening, uniform roar of 100,000 cotton spindles never returned. Instead, a chaotic mix of different mechanical sounds filled the yard. This recovery process took decades. The city of Manchester suffered through a long, highly painful transition. The citizens had to learn how to exist, without a single corporate father dictating every municipal decision. The transition proved difficult, but it saved the city from becoming a permanent ghost town. The original brick buildings proved incredibly resilient. They survived floods, urban renewal efforts, and decades of harsh weather. Today, those same red brick walls still line the eastern bank of the Merrimack River. They now house modern apartments, technology startups, college classrooms, and local restaurants. The canals that once powered the massive water turbines now provide scenic walkways for tourists and residents. The physical skeleton of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company remains intact, but the industrial soul is entirely gone. The story of Amoskeag leaves behind a permanent, ruthless lesson for the business world. The Boston Associates built the largest textile operation on the face of the earth. They controlled unimaginable wealth and dictated the daily lives of tens of thousands of people. They truly believed their sheer size made them invincible. They were completely wrong. Corporate size is not a protective shield. A long, highly successful history provides absolutely no guarantee of future survival. When a company falls in love with its own legacy, it stops watching the horizon. Amoskeag ignored changing technology. They ignored a shifting market. They chose to fight their own workers instead of fighting their true competition. No empire is too big to fail. No brand is too famous to disappear. If a business refuses to adapt to the present, the future will simply leave it behind. The echoing brick walls of Manchester stand as a permanent monument to the fatal cost of corporate arrogance.